I have a PowerPoint with some photos and a few little bits of information about Garcia Marquez, some books about him that I wanted to share, so you would have just a little overview. And I shared with Jose a couple of short stories by Garcia Marquez, two stories in both English and in Spanish. They've been translated. Everything by him has been translated into many, many languages, as you can imagine. So for some readers who prefer to read in English or prefer to read in the original Spanish, he has those available. So maybe you already have them and some of you maybe read them. I just thought it might be fun for you to have something short and really enjoyable to read by him leading up to this or afterwards, or to share with a friend or whatever. So the more reading, the merrier. So I'm gonna share my screen and we'll see how this, hopefully this is gonna work just fine. And I hope you can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great, great. Excellent. So I'm going to just glide through these slides and show you some pictures of Garcia Marquez when he was young, writing, and just fill you in about a few things about him from these pictures. So this is a picture of him working at his desk. It's just always fun to have pictures of writers when they're at their craft, and we don't get to see those necessarily too much, but I wanted you to see that. This is a cover of the cover of the first edition of 100 Years of Solitude, Cien Años de Soledad. And let me just ask, I don't see everybody here because it's because of the sharing my screen, but maybe a few of you can indicate to Jose. I don't know if some of you would rather speak in Spanish. Hablo también español, podemos conversar en español, no quiero dejar a nadie fuera de la conversación, así que indiquen, puedo hacer una especie de vaivén entre español e inglés. I'll keep going in English just to not lose anybody, but maybe just let Jose know, because I can't see everybody right now, if it would be helpful. And Jose, feel free to interrupt me. So sure. I'm not going to ramble on too long because I want there to be time for discussion and questions. So anyway, some of you may have read 100 Years of Solitude. It's maybe his best known work. And it's absolutely a magnificent novel. So very easily available through our wonderful public libraries in English or in Spanish. This is a picture of him in Sweden accepting the Nobel Prize in Literature. And that was a really exciting moment. He's not the first Latin American writer to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. In fact, the first, I believe, was Gabriela Mistral, the Chilean poet in the 1930s. She was offered the prize. So that was, I think she was the first. Miguel Ángel Asturias was also offered the prize, and a Guatemalan writer. Also, Mario Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian writer, much more recently was, and there are several others. There are several others. Octavio Paz, the Mexican poet. So Gabriela Garcia Marquez was not the first, but it was a very exciting moment in 1982. Here is a photograph of one manuscript page of his doodlings and corrections and working on his short speech in accepting the Nobel Prize in Literature. It's a lot of fun to see these, real pieces of, again, writers at work with their corrections, arguing with themselves over what word to use. And if you're interested, the speech is very beautiful. It's very short. And it's easy to find online in English or in Spanish, and there's even a voice recording from the Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin that has bought all of Garcia Marquez's papers, correspondence, manuscripts, drafts, hard drives from his computer that they have. After he died, the family had a big discussion and a big decision to make about where they were going to give or sell his archives. And this is a major literary center and archive at the University of Texas in Austin. And this is the center that won out. So that was a little bit controversial because, you know, when there are a lot of manuscripts and materials from outside of the US that are ending up in the US, where they're not remaining in Latin America, where they can be cared for and made available to the public there, it can be pretty controversial. So there was a lot of discussion about this. It was really up to the family. But I encourage you to listen to his speech if you want to hear it in Spanish or read it online. It's a beautiful speech. And he is particularly known for magical realism, sometimes also called the marvelous real, lo real maravilloso, or el realismo mágico. It's a kind of a style of writing that a lot of writers in this period, and some before and some after as well, but in the period of the 1960s, 1970s, many writers were writing in this style, but not all. Some readers who don't know that much about Latin American literature think that all Latin American literature has this magic realism, and it isn't really, that isn't really true, but it is something that really coalesced and became quite readily noticeable in a lot of writers in Garcia Marquez's generation of the 1960s and the 1970s, which is often considered the boom. I have that in this little list of notes here, with a global commercialization of many of these writers. So Carlos Fuentes, Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, among some other writers, were a group of writers that all were around roughly the same age. They were kind of the same generation. And not all of them, but many of them wrote in this magic realism style, which is kind of a funny name, since it's an oxymoron. If something is real, then we think it's not magic. If something's magic, we're kind of told it's not real. Maybe it's a trick or something we imagined or a dream or the effect of some drugs or something like that. And this kind of writing style joins a lot of events and characters and scenarios that are very readily recognizable, real, in the sense that they don't seem odd, they don't seem like science fiction, they don't seem like a fantasy work, with occurrences that happen that seem to be magical. So in 100 Years of Solitude, there are some characters that levitate and fly. There's an episode with a rain of yellow butterflies. A lot of times these are exaggerated scenes of something that is real, but when it's presented in such a way that it's so huge and enormous, like this rain of butterflies, there are lots of beautiful butterflies that migrate in and out of Colombia. And when there's a lot of them all at once, it can look like, if you're in the right place at the right time, I haven't been myself, but I would love to, it can look like a rain of butterflies. So sort of like an exaggeration that extends this and makes this occurrence seem much more enormous. And yet the characters that are in these fictions accept these occurrences or these things that to the reader seem very unusual and sometimes outlandish or wild or unthinkable. The characters in the fictions accept them as totally normal. Totally normal. So that's one of the marks of this, is that in the fictional world, these things that happen are just accepted as like anything else. So it's a surprise and it's something very wondrous for the reader, but for the characters in these stories, it's business as usual. They go about their business like it's normal. So there's kind of that disconnect for the reader that makes us really take note, particularly because the characters are not saying, oh my God, what's going on here? What is this? No, they're like, oh yeah, it's that rain of butterflies. Oh yeah, so-and-so is levitating. you know, that's just a normal thing. So, so there's a kind of an everyday way of describing these things that Garcia Marquez is a master at. I wanted to mention that because a lot of people are aware of that, or they've noticed it in some of his books, but it's not in all of his books. It's not in all of his books. He has many writings, and it shows up sometimes in his short stories, but not all the time in his short stories. And by the way, in terms of genres, he wrote, he's probably best known for his novels, but he is an absolutely wonderful short story writer. Escribió muchísimos cuentos. And he also was a very famous journalist, a screenwriter. And I'm going to get to this a little bit later, but he founded a journalism school in Cartagena on the Caribbean coast of Colombia that's still very successful, that gives out prizes and has workshops and training of journalists. I'll get to that in a little bit. So that was just to give you a little bit of information about magical realism. Garcia Marquez had a very interesting relationship with Fidel Castro of Cuba. It did put him on something of a blacklist in the US during certain years when he said that the story goes that he couldn't get a visa to come to the US, that he never would come to the US because he was friends with Fidel and because he was a communist. He did come to the US a couple of times, but he didn't come to the US that often. And Angel Esteban, who's a professor and an author who I know, he wrote this book about the very fascinating friendship and association between Fidel Castro and Garcia Marquez. So he wrote it in Spanish, it was translated into English. So that's another reference that might be interesting to pursue for some of you. Here is a book that just came out this year, a few months ago. In fact, when Jose and I were talking about this presentation, I thought, oh, that's great. I can mention this and let people know about it. And you'll see that right here in the middle, I don't know if you can see my cursor, it's shining through a little bit of the cover of the first edition of 100 Years of Solitude that I showed you just a little bit ago. Those are some of the colors and the little squares that were on there, the blue and white and red. So this is I'm sorry that the way I put the picture here, it's not really, it's hard to see the author's name. But Ascent to Glory is a story about the writing of 100 Years of Solitude by a researcher who looked at archives, correspondence between Garcia Marquez and different publishers, translators, and looked at manuscripts and drafts and things like that, particularly at that archive in Austin, Texas. So I haven't read this yet. It's very new, and I ordered it for the Rutgers Library, and I found out from our wonderful librarian that it did come. So that's something I'm going to read soon. But it's interesting that it's also sort of the story about how this novel became a global classic, like you see in the subtitle, but also how Garcia Marquez was kind of created into something of an icon of Latin American writing, magic realism for some, etc. The kind of leftist intellectual also. So it's a fascinating story. I did want to mention, as I said, this fundación that he created in Cartagena, Fundación Gabriel Garcia Marquez para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. And he was very inspired by, he was an avid and a very successful journalist. And in fact, some of his novels grow out of stories that he covered when he was a newspaper journalist. He was very inspired by North American, in the US, new journalism, what's called new journalism. That's kind of a long form narrative investigative journalism. He felt that Latin American journalists weren't really working in that kind of mode, and that it was very, very necessary for doing the kind of reporting and deep investigations that he found really worthwhile from that US style of journalism. So he created this foundation, and it still exists. And actually some of his works that were inspired by journalism are News of a Kidnapping, Noticias de un Secuestro is the title in Spanish. And is everyone following me okay in terms of my English, my Spanish? We're
Yes,
okay?
yes.
Yeah, just interrupt if there's anything.
That's good.
And another of his books, so News of a Kidnapping is a kind of a sort of a chronicle testimonial with the voices of people who had been kidnapped during the political violence in Colombia in the 80s and 90s, and which went on a lot longer than that, started much earlier, and you know, is really still going on in spite of the peace accord, which has been very fraught. So that's a really fascinating nonfiction book. All the names are changed, places are changed to protect people who would otherwise be exposed. But it is, you know, a nonfiction work, really. And then there's a novel called Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Crónica de una muerte anunciada is the title in Spanish. It's maybe my favorite work by him. It's a very short novel that's just beautiful. And it's, you know, he read the story of this in a newspaper in a very, very short little note in a newspaper about a kind of a vengeance killing by a family in a small town. And much of his writing, including the stories that I shared that, again, if you didn't read them yet, that's fine. You can read them at some other time, that I shared with Jose. He writes a lot about small town life on the Caribbean coast. And he grew up in, well, he lived in a couple of different areas, but he ended up settling and having a house in Barranquilla, which is on a river that leads right into Cartagena on the Caribbean coast, the northern coast of Colombia. And he really is fascinated by these small river and coastal towns, simple people, you know, working hard and managing in small communities. So Chronicle of a Death Foretold is another great book. So he was affectionately known as Gabo, as you saw on the title of that one book, and you may be familiar with that. Here is a mural in Medellin that was painted not too long after he died. And I just thought it was, you know, fun. It was actually on the grounds of a public library, a beautiful big public library in Medellin. And so I thought you would all enjoy that. I did visit a library where they had a collection of sort of the headlines in the newspapers from either the day or the week that he passed away. So you could see the coverage, you know, what a celebrity he was in Colombia and the amount of news coverage with photos and special sections and things about, you know, everybody saying goodbye to Gabo, like in the headline of El Tiempo, El Mundo Entero despide a Gabo. The whole world is saying farewell to Garcia Marquez. And those news clippings were in a big public library in Medellin, a very famous one called the Biblioteca de España, that actually I think is being remodeled now, so I'm not even sure that it's open right now, but it was on the top of a big hill, and the building of that library helped reclaim and restore a community where there had been a lot of violence, a lot of poverty, a lot of drugs, a lot of killings, and then this huge library became like a big community center there, and they have a lot of sort of homenajes to Garcia Marquez in this building, rooms named after him and things like that. So this beautiful folder was made by one of the librarians with those yellow butterflies on it, which is kind of a symbol from 100 Years of Solitude. And all of those news clippings were in that folder. So I thought you would like seeing a little local touch, handmade, right in a special place for reading in Colombia. And then in 2017, I happened to be in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and it was the 50-year anniversary of the publication of 100 Years of Solitude from 1967. And a public library and kind of cultural center in Buenos Aires had a whole exhibit about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So you can see here these bookmarks and pamphlets about exhibits at some of the different libraries all around, many different libraries around the city had special cases and special books on view. This is a book about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a children's book about his background. And here's a book about Macondo, which is the fictional village that is where most of 100 Years of Solitude takes place. So it was very fun to just come upon this. I didn't know we were going to see this when I was there. So you just can see internationally how famous his books are and how much he's loved. So I thought that would be something interesting for you to see. Here's another photograph of him that was taken by his son. Another one of him working hard at work, very concentrating, a little bit like the first photo that I showed. There he is looking down, not at all aware that he's being photographed. So I just wanted to add that photograph, and I think that might be the last one. Yeah, that's the last one. So I'm gonna stop sharing now so we can all be together again. And so that was just a little overview of a few highlights. I mean, I don't wanna give a long, boring lecture. Just wanted to introduce a few kind of topics that are very important in his work as a writer, as a public intellectual. He also has, I didn't show a picture of this, you can look on the library page and I'm sure you'll see lots and lots of books by him. He wrote a multi-volume autobiography that he was working on over the last few years of his life. It's called Vivir para contarla, living to tell the tale, living to tell the story. And when he found out that he had a form of cancer, he started to really work hard on putting together a sort of a memoir autobiography, and he wanted to keep going so he could finish it. So I think it's 3 volumes, and it's really fascinating work. So that's another option for delving into his life that I didn't mention before. And I just wanted to mention that, I'll put this in the chat, but the program that Jose mentioned when he was kindly introducing me is called People and Stories, Gente y Cuentos. And the website for this group is, I'm gonna put it here, peopleandstories.org. So I've been working with this group for more than 20 years, and we love Garcia Marquez's stories because this is a group where we read short stories in hospitals, prisons, homeless shelters, adult education programs, at public libraries. We've had at senior citizen centers, all kinds of different places. It's a program that's oral, so we read the stories out loud. I'm not going to do that, don't worry. But it would be great if you had a program at the West Orange Public Library sometime with a facilitator, either in English or in Spanish. We do this program in English or in Spanish. It's not a program for learning the language. It's a program to enjoy literature in a language you're comfortable with. So it's not really about literacy training or about learning the language, although you do really learn a lot indirectly about figurative language and descriptions and interesting stories that have unusual endings and weird characters. And so we read work from all over the place, things that have been translated into English or into Spanish by world writers. And we read lots of writers in English who are from the Spanish speaking world, who either write in English originally, like Juno Diaz and Gloria Anzaldúa, or writers who wrote in Spanish and have been translated into English. And it's a lot of fun, and I just wanted to mention that because I think Garcia Marquez's stories are sort of at the core of this program, which was started by a Russian immigrant to the US who spent a lot of years in Latin America with her husband, who was a development economist. Her name was Sarah Hirschman. She passed away some years ago. Well, into her 90s, she lived a wonderful life. And I was able to train with her as a facilitator, and she became a good friend. And this program is wonderful. So if you find a group that you hear about and you live near there and you can join, please do. So we have programs all over the place. We've trained we've worked so closely with public librarians and public libraries all over the country. Some very small rural public libraries that work out of a trailer in Hispanic neighborhoods, things like that in the South. And we've had programs pretty regularly at the Newark Public Library and at several cultural centers in North Jersey, in the Bronx, in Trenton. We have programs going all over the place. So just wanted to make a plug for that because it is something connected to stories. And I want to not take up too much more time with rambling on so that any of you who have questions can feel free to ask.
Marcy,
tell a story yourself about the works that you've loved by Garcia Marquez.
Marcy, if I may interject, I read 100 Years of Solitude, but I really had difficulties with it. And then I moved along to The General and the Lambeth, that particular his book, and I just, Summon Bolivar is for me is, and I just like reading a lot of his stuff, but I felt that Garces in this particular book, Bolivar he's more wounded. It seems like his death comes so slow to him, and he falls in love with a woman, and it's just so, there's a lot of tenderness, there's a lot of feeling that everything is lost. It's not a very long book like 100 Years Solitude, but I just felt it was, he must have written this book while he was crying all the time. Am I right? Or what's your feeling on that, Marcy?
Well, that's a great comment. That's a great comment. And I'll just add a little something to the context of that, is that a lot of these boom writers who were very friendly with one another, Carlos Fuentes, et cetera, also, well, there was a big group of them, probably about 8 or 10 of them. They decided they were at a cafe or a dinner or something in Paris that one of them was working on a novel about a tyrant or a dictator. And then they decided that they would all take this pledge that each one was going to write about a dictator or a conqueror or a kind of a Latin American man of action, if not directly a dictator. And so this was Garcia Marquez's novel for that. And it was just a kind of a gentleman's agreement. It wasn't like anything through a publisher or anything like that. But I think it's just kind of fun to know that they were all talking about those novels as they were writing them within the same few years. So I just wanted to mention that as a little context around that novel. And I do think you're right that there's something very humanizing about his depiction of Bolivar. And that's really what novels do. Novels create these characters that we can relate to. And if we can't relate to them, then there's this sort of disconnect and it becomes more like an epic or something about a hero that's very untouchable for us and very distant from us. And what a novel does is it brings those characters into our world where we feel almost like we might know them or understand their inner thoughts or have a vision into what really makes them tick and what are their doubts, what are their downfalls, what are their failures, what are their sadnesses, what are their and also their triumphs, but I think that that's what you mentioned really captures sort of what novels do by bringing those characters into a human scale. And that's something that we think about Bolivar and we think about, on a statue and, on money, on monuments, and we don't, when we think of sort of the historical documents, and then a novel fictionalizes that to some degree, but there are many novels, historical fiction is based on a lot of historical research too. So there's a way that I think the novel as a form can really humanize those characters. So let's see, I don't know if anybody else has a question or if you want to tell about something you read. Rochelle, did you want to add
Yeah,
something, please?
I would love it if you could talk a little bit about magic realism and how it may or how it does express the syncretism that exists in Latin America due to the history. Um, if you could talk a little bit about that'd be awesome.
Sure, sure, sure. Thanks for the question. Well, really, there's a very famous essay by Alejo Carpentier, who's a Cuban writer. I can put his name in the chat. Called Lo Real Maravilloso. I'm forgetting the rest of the title, but and it's been anthologized and it's been translated, so it's not that hard to find. In fact, the journal Review, I think the subtitle is something like A Journal of the Americas or something like that. It's a really nice magazine that comes out a few times a year in English, and I know they did a special issue on magic realism, and Carpentier's essay is published in that in English. So that's one source for it, and it's in some others also. It's in some others. It's in some anthologized books of essays and things like that. It's not that hard to find. And that was written in 1949. It was actually the preface to a novel by Alejo Carpentier called The Kingdom of This World, El Reino de Este Mundo. And it was published together with that novel. It's a short novel as a sort of a preface. So that's kind of interesting also. And then it was also published and distributed around in different media as well. And this is where Carpentier, and I'm going back to Carpentier because this was kind of at the base of the writers in Garcia Marquez's generation who were a little bit younger than Carpentier. This was something that sort of established a recognizable field for why magic realism is something so natural in Latin America itself. And so Carpentier talks about the mixtures of cultures, that syncretism that you mentioned in Latin America, from the African presence, the indigenous presence, you know, the presence of Asians, which I don't think he really mentioned, but we know that that you know, was maybe a little bit more prevalent later, and in some places earlier. You know, he mentioned what he wanted to mention, but you know, and then the peninsular influence from Spain, from Europe, the Italian influence in Latin America and certain parts of Latin America too. So he talked about this being a source for different worldviews, different religious practices, different ways of understanding the world, understanding myths, understanding origins, and that mesh of all of those different cultures created a very fertile ground for artists and writers to pick up on and really celebrate that kind of multicultural. I mean, now we would think of it as multiculturalism, and even now for us, that's already kind of an old term. You know, I think we're using other kinds of things now, but to express those ideas. But I think that that's something that Garcia Marquez really recognized, and that essay became really famous and circulated all around. It was translated and stuff. So I wanted to mention that, even though I think that Garcia Marquez doesn't, that's something that's maybe on the sidelines, some of those justifications in an essay about magic realism. But one of the things that he talks about in his speech in accepting the Nobel Prize is the way that Latin American literature, particularly fiction, short stories and novels, really grows out of the colonial writings like Columbus's diary and the various explorers, Pizarro, et cetera, who traveled around and, you know, with not always the best intentions, as we know, but these were the first writings in Spanish about what was considered then the New World it wasn't new to the people who were already living there, the indigenous people already living there, of course. But this, these, according to Garcia Marquez, these explorers that wrote, you know, diaries, reports, they were called often Cronicas. And that's why it's not a coincidence that Garcia Marquez has a novel that has the word Cronica in there, a chronicle or a sort of a chronological telling with the date and the time and moving in order and in incorporating that time in there, which is what happens when you write a diary, when you write a travel log. Well, this is what these writers were doing. They weren't writers, they were explorers. Some of them were priests who were interested in Christianizing the indigenous people. Some of them were looking for natural resources that could be exported and exploited, looking for slave labor. You know, all of that was going on. It was a major economic enterprise, but those writings were the first writings in Spanish that actually had descriptions about what these places looked like. And of course, they're incredibly elaborate and detailed, and the birds and the enormous rivers, and of course the expanses. You know, if you just look at a map, look at Europe. Europe is kind of little. Look at Latin America. It's huge. I mean, all of Europe could fit into Brazil and have lots of room left over in Brazil. So the things that they were seeing of like the Amazon, the plains, the kinds of plant and animal life that they were seeing was absolutely like they were in a dream. I mean, it was just completely mind-boggling to them. They were amazed. And in fact, Columbus's diary, which I read the diaries of the 4 trips that he took across the Atlantic, he uses the word marvelous or a marvel so many times that there's actually a literary critic who did a study counting how many times and the different ways in which Columbus used the word marvelous. So this idea of the marvelous real, the reality that's kind of beyond real, that's like bigger than what we could have expected, is something that really comes out of that amazement of European travelers coming over and seeing expanses and colors and birds and, you know, just a reality that's nothing like anything they could have imagined. And in fact, in one of the short stories, I think one of the ones that I shared with you, the one, Baltasar's Marvelous Afternoon, La Prodigiosa Tarde de Baltasar. I'm making a jump here, but you'll see the connection. It's a story about a poor carpenter who makes beautiful bird cages. And there's a little boy who's like 5 years old who says, oh, well, I have this new, you know, I think it's called a tupial or something. It's some kind of a toucanish kind of bird. And he says, you know, I want a cage like from you for my bird. And so he's a very simple guy, and he says, okay, I'll make you one. And he makes this amazing cage, and it's just fabulous. And at one point, somebody else in the town comes up and looks at it, and he says, no cabe en la imaginación, or something like va más allá de la imaginación. It's beyond imagination. It's so beautiful. It's a beyond imagination. And it's one of the phrases in a story. It's very short, and it's not that major to what happens in the story, except that everything that he makes is really very beautiful and very wonderful, and everybody admires, and there's like a bidding war. Everyone wants this. And he says, no, I saved it for, you know, I can't remember the kid's name now. He said, I made it for him. It's for him. It's for his bird. You can't buy it. I can make you another one, but this one is for him. And so that idea of something that's beyond the imagination, that doesn't fit into our imagination, is really what these explorers expressed when they were writing back to, you know, the Catholic king and queen in Spain, or whoever was sponsoring their trip. Now, some of that was also a bit of a sales job. You have to make it sound good. If you go there and say, everything's boring, it's ugly, the people are creepy, I don't think we should go back. Well, then you're not going to get another trip paid, right? So you got to make it sound good. So some of it was also aggrandizing himself and making sure that he was in the good graces. That was a lot of money to send all those boats over there. and with all the people to help and the soldiers and whatever. So you got to make it sound like it was a reasonable enterprise. And the Queen Isabella, it turns out, loved birds. Columbus found that out, and he put lots of details about birds in the diary. So, you know, some of these things are not there because necessarily he loved birds, but his sponsors love birds. So, okay, we'll give them some birds. And so, you know, you could see this idea of an imaginary place, a place kind of yearned for, particularly at a time when Europe was feeling very small. There was a lot of disease. There was, we know something about that now, don't we, over here and everywhere. There was a lot of struggle over resources. There was a lot of class struggle and poverty in certain parts of Europe. So this sort of open space, like this huge horizon, all of a sudden this like new frontier was sort of the great hope. So his diary was translated into lots and lots of languages and was a huge bestseller all around Europe because it was something that plugged into what people were needing. So I think that we can see that some of that got embedded into ways of looking at Latin America. There's also been several different literary groups and generations that got tired of this magic realism thing and the exoticism and the tropical kind of fantasy of it all, and, you know, started to write, you know, crime fiction and narco corridos and you know, there's all kinds of different genres. So I don't want to make it sound like all literature from Latin America works from that principle. It really doesn't. And there's certainly, by some writers, a bit of a rejection of that marketing tool. There was a lot of expectation that writers, after those boom novels, that anybody from Latin America, if they weren't writing something magic realist, it was like, well, doesn't really seem very Latin American to me. You know, the editors were like, they got kind of hooked on that because it sold. And it sold in part because there were lots of translations. There was a lot of marketing. The timing was right internationally. I mean, there were all kinds of factors. They're great novels. They're definitely wonderful novels, but it sort of put Latin America on the map for European and readers in English. Because of all of that. So I don't know, it was a little bit of a roundabout way to answer your question, but does that help a little bit? Okay, good. Thank you. Susan, I think maybe you have a question, but you need to unmute. Yeah, great.
I was just going to say that 100 Years of Solitude is my favorite book ever.
Oh, good.
I picked it up for a quarter, you know, from a secondhand antique store, and I had never heard of him. And I read it, and I thought it was just the best book I ever read in my life. And then decades later, a book club in New Jersey was reading it. So I read it, and like the first 30 pages, I was thinking, what? I thought this was the best book I ever read in my life. What did I like? And then again, best book I ever read in my life.
Wow.
And I also like Love in the Time of Cholera.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's a beautiful novel. It's easier to read than 100 Years of Solitude, I would say. And it's a book that lots of people have been talking about during the pandemic, actually. It's come up a lot in, you know, people going back to the Decameron, to Camus' The Plague. You know, you've seen like people reread, and it's really a magnificent book. Love in the Time of Cholera.
The movie with, I was telling my daughter, with Shakira, didn't she?
I didn't see it.
Oh, you didn't see?
No, I didn't see the film.
Time of Cholera.
I didn't see the film. What do you think of it? Should I see it? Did you like it?
It was fun.
Okay. There actually are several films based on Garcia Marquez short stories. And there's one called Letters in the Park, or Letters to the Park. I think Letters in the Park. And that's a beautiful film. And there's a film version also of Chronicle of a Death Foretold that's very good.
I think there's a film, I was just telling my daughter, there's a film of a little tiny story in 100 Years of Solitude. Somebody made a film out of the character, somebody burned her, a young woman burned her mother or her aunt's house down. Do you remember that? She burned the house down by accident. And then she had to, her mother made her go into prostitution until she paid off the house. And she was dragging her mattress from town to town. And I think somebody made a film out of just that story.
Yeah, that it rings a bell, but I can't remember the film, you know, what it was called. But I'm glad you mentioned that because I am remembering that vaguely.
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe her name.
Letters into the Park, which also has a little bit of it spills over into Chronicle of a Death Foretold, is about a whole bunch of letters that were never delivered. That, you know, the post office got overwhelmed in some small area and they just kind of stuffed a whole lot of mail into like a shed somewhere. And then years later, somebody, let's hope this doesn't happen with our mail-in ballots, right? I probably shouldn't have even brought this up this close to the election. Sorry. We're all gonna have nightmares. But Garcia Marquez saw that, or maybe wrote a note for a newspaper about this, the discovery of, like, you know, barrels and barrels of mail that just got like stuck. And he just found that fascinating. Like, what could be all the stories in there of letters that, you know, didn't get delivered. And so Letters from the Park is one of the stories that he wrote out of that. And then there's something about collected letters also that were saved in a trunk that comes up in Chronicle of a Death Foretold. So he loved all these different ideas of writing, you know, writing journalism, writing film scripts, and writing about writers. Sometimes he has characters who are journalists, characters.
100 Years of Solitude, isn't it about someone writing this whole?
It is. And the novel ends up being that book that was trying to be written. It's like this big circular thing. Yeah. With the prophecy of the child that's going to be born with a pig's tail and all, you know, and Ursula living 100 years. So it's, you know,
And
I mean, now,
like, are we at, like, I remember reading about the Colombian family that had insomnia, and that's, you know what I mean? Like, some of his things that seem so incredible, or all the people who were killed, all the banana plantation workers.
Yeah.
These things were actually based on real things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, in the part of the novel in 100 Years of Solitude where people have that, you know, forgetfulness disease, and and they have to put little, it's sort of like the equivalent of Post-its. They have to, like, put the name of things all over the house because they're forgetting the names of things. So it's like an amnesia that has to do with language. And it's another example of him looking at always being sort of self-reflective about language. And again, in the novel, the reader is like, what? You know, or is this like some sort of dementia, or what? It happens, the people aren't necessarily, you know, old or infirm or with a brain injury or anything. And the characters in the novel are like, oh yeah, they got the forgetfulness disease. Like, it happens. Like, oh yeah, we got a cold. So again, that magic, you know, thing of not really finding it all that surprising, just like, yeah, we better start labeling things because we might catch it. And just going on like normal, more or less normal.
Marcy, I got one question I want to ask you again, another one. This leftist intellectualists, and now you're talking about writers like Marquez, correct?
Yeah, I mean, in his generation, there was a group of them that all were, you know, at that time. I mean, some of them, Vargas Llosa was part of that group, and he was quite a leftist for a while, and he switched and became actually very conservative.
My question is that, you know, the left these days get beat up all the time, but in throughout Latin America, you know, in the last 50 years, you've had dictators, you know, running a lot of Latin American countries. How was that clash between the dictators and the left trying to, you know, look at the situation in some of these countries?
Well, it's really difficult to generalize because you've got dictators from the left and you've got dictators from the right. So there are right wing, right now, not so much right wing military dictatorships, but there were in the 60s in Brazil, in the 70s and 80s in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile. There were right wing dictators who were absolutely savage with leftist intellectuals or anybody in the opposition. So, huge numbers of 30,000 people is the official number of disappeared in Argentina, just in Argentina, and that's considered probably a low number and not accurate. That
Right.
it's too low. And about 5,000 in Chile and a few thousand in Uruguay. So the right-wing dictatorships were, really, really incredibly bloody and tragic for the left. In Cuba, we've had, since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, we've had a socialist communist regime in power that's actually loosened up economically quite a lot as Fidel got older and as his brother Raul took over. I think that was in around 2006. And then eventually, that now there's another president, Diaz-Canel, and they have, created more private businesses. There's it's a little bit looser. The economy is a little bit looser now, but it has basically been run like a police state. I mean, it's very safe. There's no crime. You can hitchhike anywhere, but that's because there's surveillance everywhere. There's, the growth of the internet there has been incredibly controlled and slow. People didn't have cell phones until very recently. And Venezuela also with Chavez, had 14 years of Chavez, who was also a leftist, kind of a dictator style president. We've had in Latin America, authoritarian regimes from the left and from the right.
Okay.
Sadly. And so it's difficult and then in Colombia, where Garcia Marquez is from, to bring it back to him a little bit, 50 plus years of political violence between leftist insurgents and guerrillas, the military, the paramilitary. You've had left-leaning and right-leaning elected governments, democratically elected governments, and it's still lasted. It's been the longest armed conflict in the Americas. So it's so complex, and in each place, there are different factors. So it's a little bit difficult to. Unfortunately, the U.S. had a big hand in the right-wing dictatorships in the 70s. Really, most of them started in the 70s in the Southern Cone, in part from fear of more sort of left-leaning revolutions that would affect allies and military bases for the U.S. at the time. So we're in a different geopolitical situation now. So we'll see. But yeah, I mean, and it's very sad stories, But it's a great question. And it's something that Garcia Marquez really engages with in The General and His Labyrinth, and also in 100 Years of Solitude. That first line, Aureliano Buendía, frente al pelotón de fusilamiento, in front of the firing squad. The novel opens with a character in front of a firing squad.
Yeah.
And so, you have right from that start a kind of really frightening, violent military confrontation. And, he ends up okay, but what a way to start. What a great first line.
Exactly. So true.
So let's see if there are any other questions. And I hope you'll read the stories that Jose will be able to send you if you're on his mailing list and stuff like that, because you'll enjoy them. You'll enjoy them. And they're easy to find.
Yeah.
They're easy to find. I mean, his work has been translated, and so in Spanish or in English, you can definitely read his short stories and his novels. There's a lot of them, and his memoir. So there's great stuff ahead for reading.
Any final questions? Well, I want to thank everybody. Marcy, I want to thank you so much. I have about 1 million questions, but I'll leave it for I'll email you and maybe,
Okay.
because, it is September. No, excuse me. It is October. This is a very important time for Hispanics. And I appreciate you joining us in the celebration of this month here in West Orange Public Library.
Well, it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for joining and asking questions and being great readers and supporting your public library.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right,
Hasta la
everybody.
próxima.
Okay.
Que sigan muy bien.
Gracias.
Be well. A ustedes.
All right.